Hi guys, tonight I want to take you somewhere very far away, not across the ocean, not back a few centuries, but back to a time before cities, before borders, before written history decided what was worth remembering. Imagine the world just as the sun disappears beyond the horizon. There are no lights turning on, no streets glowing back to life. No screens, no clocks, no notifications waiting for you. Only darkness, slow, natural, unquestioned. This is the world human beings lived in for more than 95% of our existence. A world without nations, without money, without kings or laws written in stone. And yet, they were not lost. They were not confused. They were not waiting for civilization to arrive and save them. They knew where to sleep, they knew what to eat, they knew who they belonged to, and they knew when the fire needed tending. Tonight's story is not about monsters or forgotten gods or lost advanced technologies. It is about something far quieter. It is about how humans actually lived before civilization, how they woke up, how they moved through the land, how they shared food, raised children, faced death, and understood the world around them without cities telling them who they were. There will be no heroes in this story, no villains either, only people. People whose lives were shaped not by schedules, but by seasons. Not by property, but by memory. Not by ambition, but by survival and belonging. If you're listening at night, perhaps in a quiet room, perhaps while the world outside has finally slowed down, you don't need to stay alert. Let the story move at its own pace. Let the images come and go. Nothing here needs to be memorized, because before civilization taught us to record everything, humans learned by listening, and that is where we begin. There was no moment marked as a beginning. There was no day when human beings woke up knowing that from that point on, they had entered a different stage of themselves. Human life did not shift through doors flung open wide. It did not arrive with a bell announcing its change, with a moment clearly marked on a timeline. It changed slowly, almost silently, like a path gradually worn down by repeated footsteps, so much so that only when one stops and looks back does it become clear how far the journey has gone. No one in the past ever woke up one morning knowing today we are living in the time before civilization. That concept did not exist within their experience. It was named much later, after humans had grown accustomed to dividing time into periods accustomed to seeing the world as a sequence of stages with a beginning and an end. And so, when we imagine before civilization, we often unconsciously turn it into a void, a hazy expanse lying before history, a place where humans are surrounded by scarcity, violence, and chaos, where they live in darkness, waiting for something great to arrive and pull them into the light cities, writing laws, the state. But that picture is drawn from the present. It reflects our values today rather than how people at that time experienced their world. For those who lived in that era, there was no sense that something was missing. No idea that their lives were in an unfinished state. No measuring stick by which today was compared to a distant future. Their world was not a draft of a better version. It was everything that existed, complete within its limits, familiar in every small detail, and sufficient for living. They did not dream of cities because they had never needed a place more crowded than the group whose faces they knew intimately. They did not long for writing because memory never existed outside the body and the voice of the community. They did not seek abstract laws because order was maintained each day through presence, mutual dependence, and the direct consequences of action. When the sun rose, the world began again, not as an opportunity for progress, but as a familiar cycle. When the sun set, there was no sense of loss, only a shift in rhythm. Day and night were not opposites. They followed one another like breath. Within that rhythm, humans did not stand outside the world to evaluate it. They were inside it. They did not observe nature as an object, but lived with it as a relationship. And for that reason, what we call before civilization was never for them a void waiting to be filled. It was a world in motion, quiet, continuous, and ordered in its own way. When the sun went down, darkness did not bring a vague fear of the unknown. It marked the end of a day's labor and opened another rhythm of life. Fire was lit, bodies rested, stories began. There were no clocks to measure time, no calendars to count days. Time was felt through the warmth or chill on the skin, through the length of shadows, through the changing sounds of insects with the seasons. In that world, humans did not separate themselves from nature. They did not live in nature, nor did they conquer it. They were part of it, as rivers are part of the land, as wind is part of the sky. Every human movement unfolded within a continuous relationship with the surrounding environment. When food became scarce, they moved. When the weather shifted, they adapted. When a place became familiar, they remembered it not with maps, but with stories. Stories were where memory was stored, not in books, not carved into stone, but in voices, in rhythms of telling, in repetition across generations. A stream was not merely a source of water. It was the place where we stopped when the dry season dragged on. A valley was not merely terrain. It was where his grandfather once brought down a great animal. Space carried memory. Places carried history. And history then was not a sequence of events, but a web of lived experience. The concept of civilization emerged very late in this flow of time. For most of humanity's existence, there was no state, no fixed borders, no class divisions based on wealth. The structures we now consider foundational to modern society, law, taxation, centralized power, are all recent inventions, young compared to the age of humanity itself. Before those structures appeared, humans already knew how to live together. Not through commands, but through relationships. Not through written law, but through collective memory. Not through punishment, but through mutual dependence. In small groups of only a few dozen people, no one could survive alone. And this was not a moral slogan, but a biological reality. An individual separated from the group lost not only protection, but shared memory, accumulated knowledge across generations, and the ability to exist in an ever-changing environment. Each person was held within the group by invisible yet resilient bonds. Food was shared not out of abstract altruism, but because tomorrow the roles might reverse. Children were cared for by many hands because their lives belonged not to one individual, but to the future of the group itself. The sick were not casually left behind because experience taught a simple truth. Today, it is them. Tomorrow, it could be anyone. And when death arrived, something not unfamiliar in that world, humans did not face it alone. The presence of the community at the final moment was not only comfort, it was a way to ensure that memory did not vanish with the last breath. A death that is witnessed is a death that is remembered. And memory then was the only form of continuation. Within that social structure, power, if it can even be called that, did not rest in the ability to force others to obey. No one was strong enough to dominate for long. No one possessed enough resources to sustain control. Power existed in a different form: trust. Those who were listened to were those who had survived many harsh seasons, who had made sound decisions when all choices were uncertain. Those who were followed were those who knew the way not only geographically, but existentially. They knew when to leave before the land was exhausted. They knew when to stay despite fear. They knew how to read subtle signs. Others overlooked the sudden silence of birds, a shift in wind direction, faint tracks in damp soil. Leadership was not granted. It was recognized and could be lost at any moment if trust faded. There were no thrones to inherit, no crowns to pass down, no symbols raised above others to remind anyone they stood higher. Every position was temporary. Every role was bound to circumstance. This does not mean that the world was free of conflict. Humans in every era carry tensions between needs and resources, between individual and group, between fear and hope. But unlike later state-based societies, conflict in pre-civilized societies did not harden into systems. There were no institutions to sustain long-term violence, no standing armies, no surplus stores large enough to support warfare across many seasons. Violence, when it occurred, was personal and situational. It was not accumulated, not legitimized, and not passed down as a structure of power. And therefore, it could not sustain itself over time. We often label this era prehistory as if it were merely a rough prologue to a greater story, a waiting period before history truly began. But measured by time, written history occupies only a thin slice of humanity's journey. What remains long, deep, and silent is the life of humans before civilization. A life not recorded in texts, but etched into bodies, habits, and ways of responding to the world. This was not an age of ignorance, not a time when humans knew nothing. It was the age of a different kind of knowing, a kind of understanding that did not separate reason from experience, that did not divide knowledge into disciplines or abstract concepts, but bound it tightly to action, consequence, and daily survival. Understanding was not abstracted into ideas. It lived in the body, in how hands held tools, in how eyes read the sky, in how ears distinguished familiar and unfamiliar sounds in the dark. Humans learned by living in the world, not by standing outside it to analyze. A child was not taught how to hunt. They followed adults, observed, imitated, failed, and tried again. Knowledge flowed like a current, not like a command, and so there was no clear boundary between learning and living. When we call this era uncivilized, we impose a modern measure on a world that did not operate by that logic. We judge it by what it lacked rather than by what it was. But for those who lived within it, there was no concept of progress, no upward line, only continuation season after season, generation after generation. Stability did not come from controlling the world, but from understanding one's limits within it. They knew when to leave. They knew when to stay. They knew when to share and when to conserve. Not because they possessed economic theory, but because mistakes meant death. In that world, humans did not accumulate more than necessary. Not because they were virtuous, but because constant movement made excess a burden. Everything carried had to justify its weight. Every object had to earn its place. Sufficiency was not a moral philosophy. It was a condition of survival. And that is why the world before civilization was not as chaotic as we imagine. It functioned through soft rules, flexible, adaptive, and unwritten. Looking back from the present, it is easy to believe that civilization was the first light piercing the darkness. But perhaps civilization was simply a different kind of light, brighter, more focused, and more blinding. Before that light appeared, the world was not blind. It was illuminated by other sources: firelight, moon, and stars, memory, and deep familiarity with the living environment. This chapter does not seek to glorify the past, nor does it seek to deny the present. It simply restores the place of a period that has been misunderstood for too long. Before civilization, humans did not live in the darkness of deprivation. They lived within another order, one built not of stone and writing, but of relationships, experience, and time. And to understand what humanity later became, we must begin here. Not with the first city, not with the first agriculture, but with the world that existed long before anyone thought to call it uncivilized. A typical day in pre-civilization. Human life begins with no alarm clock. There is no fixed hour at which a new day must start. Morning arrives not as an order, but as a very slight shift in the world around them. Light threads its way through the canopy. The air feels cooler on the skin. Familiar sounds begin to return, wind birds, the soft, careful footsteps of those who woke earlier. A person opens their eyes not because they have somewhere to be, but because their body is ready. In the world before civilization, a day is not divided into abstract blocks of time. There is no 8 a.m. There is no late or on time. Time is felt through sensation, the sensation of hunger becoming clearer, the sensation of cold slowly loosening the sensation that the light is now enough to see the face of the person beside you. A new day does not arrive carrying pressure to do more than yesterday. It carries only one simple question repeated across thousands of generations. How will we live today so that tomorrow we are still here? The first task is not long-term planning, not accumulation. It is identifying as calmly as possible where food will come from today. A few people leave the group very early, not because they were commanded and not because they were assigned from a list in advance. They leave because their bodies suited on that particular day, because their legs are still strong, because a wound has healed, because their experience is needed outside. They do not go alone. No one hunts or searches for food in isolation. A single person is a risk not only in the face of predators, but in the face of mistakes, exhaustion, and the environment's surprises. Hunting, gathering, and observing are not separate activities. They weave together within the same journey. A small group moves slowly, speaks little, and pays attention to every minor change on the ground. A branch, freshly broken grass, newly flattened, a strange scent carried in the air. Someone walks in front, not to command, but to read the path. Someone walks behind, watching the wider picture, making sure no one falls out of sight. If they hunt, the first step is not to strike, but to follow. Tracking can last for hours, sometimes for days. Most of the time is spent moving in silence, reading signs, and accepting that the prey may disappear. A successful hunt is rarely the result of raw strength. It is the result of patience and coordination. The prey is guided toward unfavorable terrain, forced to move too long, worn down not by immediate violence, but by time. Alongside hunting is gathering work no less important and often a more stable source of food. Those who gather know with precision which plants are edible, which cause pain, which can be eaten only during a very brief window each year. They know how to dig up roots without destroying what must remain. They know how to pick fruit while leaving enough for the next season. They know when an area has been overused and must be left behind. This is not random knowledge. It is the result of thousands of trials and errors. And in the past, those errors were paid for with sickness or death. Meanwhile, near the camp, older people take on other tasks, no less important, only involving less movement. They repair tools, not to make them look good, but to make them work for a while longer. A stone blade is resharpened many times. A wooden handle is replaced. A chipped point is adjusted so it can still pierce an animal's hide. A tool is not thrown away simply because it breaks, because every tool is the condensed form of time, of effort, and of knowledge. They are also the keepers of the fire. Keeping it is not merely making sure it does not go out, but ensuring that when the group returns, the world is still in some small way under control. The fire must be sheltered from wind. Wood must be prepared ahead of time. Ash must be cleared so it does not spread into something dangerous. Watching over small children is constant work, too. Not to keep them quiet, but to keep them alive. Children are allowed to play, but they are never completely unwatched. An eye is always following from a distance. A hand is always ready to pull them back if needed. Older people do not only care, they observe and they remember. They notice which child has a sharper eye for detail, which one is agile, which one is easily distracted. These observations are not spoken aloud. They accumulate in silence and shape how the community responds later. The younger ones, when they go far, carry as little as possible. No unnecessary items. No just in case. Everything carried must have a clear reason. A stone knife, binding cord, perhaps a small pouch for water, because moving fast can matter more than preparing perfectly, and over-preparation can become a burden. No one in the group believes their work is lower or higher than another's. There is no system that compares the value of labor. Hunting is not ranked above repairing tools. Gathering is not beneath tending the fire. Everything points toward the same goal, keeping the group alive for one more day. In a day like this, no one is truly idle. There are only people doing different things at different times in the way their bodies and experience allow. And it is precisely this flexibility, not rigid discipline, that helps humans survive in a world that is never stable. No one carries more than necessary, because every extra weight is a slower step. Hunting is not a chain of victories. Most of the time is failure, observation, adjustment, and waiting. A whole day may pass and bring back nothing but information. The tracks have shifted direction. This season no longer fits, or a place that once was familiar is now depleted. That information is not considered useless. It is living knowledge for the days ahead. When the sun climbs high and the light begins to fall straight down onto the ground, the pace of movement slows naturally. Not because motivation is lacking, and not because of laziness, but because the body knows its limits carved deep across generations, by fatigue injury, and sometimes death. Humans before civilization did not live in a world where productivity was measured. They did not optimize how many tasks could be completed in a day. They optimized the ability to remain alive through many days in a row. Overworking when the sun is at its peak brings no advantage. It makes the body hotter, thirstier, slower. And a body that is exhausted in the afternoon may be a body that cannot respond in time when danger appears. In a world with no backup, no medicine, no storehouses of food to repair a mistake, a weakening, even a small one, can become a serious risk. So, midday is not a time to push, but a time to adjust. If there is food, they eat. Not too much, not for storing inside the body only enough to keep strength steady. If there is shade, they stop. They do not treat rest as failure. They treat it as a way to keep the rhythm from breaking. If there is nothing else to do, they observe. They watch how the light changes. They watch insects on the ground. They watch for small signs that the weather is turning. The midday pause carries no guilt. It is not a reward for labor and not something you must earn. Rest is part of the rhythm of life, like moving, like searching, like waiting. During this time, children stay nearby. They play, but not in the way we commonly mean entertainment. For them, Play is how the body learns how to exist in the world. They run to feel their own speed. They climb to test the limits of hands and feet. They fall to learn how hard the ground is. And they stand again, not praised, not scolded, because standing again is simply what happens. There is no clear boundary between the space of adults and the space of children. Life unfolds in a shared space where every action can be seen and every mistake carries an immediate lesson. Children learn by being close to adults. They see how a tool is held so it does not injure the hand. They see where danger comes from, not through warnings, but through an adult's reflex when something is wrong. They learn silence when silence is necessary. They learn when to move, when to stand still, when to observe instead of act. There are no lectures, no classrooms, no moment labeled begin learning. There is only repetition, day after day, one action following another, until the body records what must be recorded and no longer needs to think about it. And in those quiet stretches in the middle of the day, knowledge is not passed down as information. It soaks into a person the way warmth soaks into skin, under shade, slowly, evenly, and almost unnoticed until it has become part of them. When the light begins to soften and the shadows of familiar things stretch longer across the ground, the group returns not in a rush, not with a clear signal, but with a quiet agreement as everyone senses the day closing. They do not always bring food. Some days the prey disappears. Some seasons the land no longer gives as much as it once did. But they almost always bring something else, something you cannot hold, cannot pile into a heap, yet is no less valuable than food, information. A new path opened after rain. An old route has become dangerous. A small sign that the season is turning leaves, falling earlier. Water thinning faster birds, changing their rhythm in the afternoon. That information does not belong to an individual. It is not kept to create personal advantage. As soon as the group returns to camp, it is spoken not as a formal report, but as a natural part of shared presence. In that world, knowledge has value only when it is shared. Something known but not spoken is something that can vanish with the person who knows it. And memory, if it is not placed into the community, cannot last long enough to become experience. So, no one keeps information for themselves. Not because they are nobler, but because they understand the consequences of silence in the wrong place. Food, if there is any, is set down and divided. There is no exact calculation, no fixed unit of measurement. The division does not rely on how many hours were walked or on recorded merit, but on a sense of fairness the community has grown over time by living together. The weaker are not left hungry, not because of an abstract moral principle, but because everyone understands that a group's strength is not found in its strongest member, but in refusing to let anyone fall behind. As the sun drops lower still and the light becomes soft, the world changes rhythm again slowly without needing a reminder. Heavy work stops. Attention withdraws from wide space and gradually gathers into a nearer circle, where people can see one another in the last remaining light. The fire is lit, not only to warm, not only to cook. Fire is how humans keep the world within reach when night arrives. It drives animals back with light and smoke. It pushes darkness away by just enough. And more than anything, it creates a center, a point people naturally gather around. In firelight, faces become clearer. Familiar features appear in the shifting glow. Voices carry farther, not because they are louder, but because the world has grown quieter. And in that moment, as the outside world shrinks beyond the edge of the light, memory is called by name. What happened during the day is placed into story. What must be remembered is repeated naturally, not as a lesson, but as part of shared life. Dusk does not end the day. It only turns the day into another shape, slower, closer, and quieter. Night is not the frightening emptiness we often imagine when looking back from a modern world full of light. For humans before civilization, night is not a disruption of life, but an inseparable part of the cycle, different from day, yet not opposed to it. Day and night do not stand on opposite sides of a boundary. They follow each other like an inhale and an exhale. One cannot exist without the other. When darkness settles beyond the rim of firelight, people do not try to banish it completely. They do not turn night into day. They accept it and learn how to be inside it. Humans before civilization do not kill time at night. That idea does not exist. Time is not something that must be filled. It is something moving, and they move with it. In the low fading firelight, movement slows. Voices soften. The silence between sentences grows longer. No one feels the need to constantly produce sound. And in that slow space, stories begin. They are not told merely for entertainment, not to forget an exhausting day, not to fill silence. Stories carry information compressed into images, wrapped in emotion, remembered through repetition. They speak of where danger lies when light disappears. They recall who once made a mistake and what it cost. They remind listeners of actions that must not be repeated, not through commands, but through memory. Early myth is not created to explain the universe in a scientific sense. It does not answer why the stars move or why thunder appears. It answers a different question, far more practical. How do we survive? A dangerous animal is not only an animal, it becomes a character with habits, with patterns, with rules of its own. And so the threat is no longer abstract. It has shape, it has story, and for that reason, it is easier to remember. A fatal mistake is not told as a random accident. It becomes a warning story repeated again and again until no one treats it lightly. A sacred place is not defined only by geography. It is placed inside the space of story, becoming a place not to violate, not to mock, not to forget. In this way, the world gains structure without maps or written law. Space is organized by memory. Behavior is guided by story. Children sit nearby, not always understanding every detail, but feeling the rhythm of telling. They know when an adult's voice drops, when firelight reflects on a face in an unfamiliar way. They learn that some stories are not for laughter, some moments are not for interruption, and sometimes silence matters more than questions. Night, in this way, is not a time of fear, but a time of remembering. When a story ends, no one needs to declare that the lesson has been delivered. If the story is strong enough, it will remain not in the head, but in how people react when a similar situation appears. And when the fire becomes only small embers, when story dissolves into silence, night continues to flow, asking nothing more. It simply is holding people in familiar darkness, as it has done long before anyone thought to call it frightening. Story gives the world structure not through law, but through meaning. When the story quiets and the fire is only a few small embers, no one signals that it is time to sleep. Sleep is not announced. It arrives like a thin mist settling over a body, tired in a familiar way. Humans before civilization do not go to sleep the way we do. They do not withdraw from the world. They simply allow the world to slow enough for the body to lie still within it. There is no private room, no door to close. Sleep happens in shared space, where people lie close together, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to feel the slight motion when someone turns. Sleeping together is not a sign of intimacy. It is a form of safety. In darkness, a lone body is vulnerable. But many bodies close together create warmth, create familiar sound, create the feeling that the world is still being watched. No one needs to open their eyes to check. Hearing the steady breathing of the person beside you is enough to know that things are still all right. Darkness is not pushed away completely. It is not treated as an enemy. It is allowed to be there, surrounding the small remaining circle of ember light, as part of the world that does not need conquering. People do not sleep in absolute silence. They sleep with familiar sounds, wind moving through leaves, insects keeping rhythm wood, cracking softly as embers cool. Those sounds do not startle them. On the contrary, they are proof that the world is still working as it should. The body relaxes not because it is perfectly safe, but because it has learned that this level of safety is enough. In sleep, a person does not separate from the group. Even as awareness withdraws, the presence of others remains a steady ground on which dreams can rest. Children sleep among adults, not as special protection, but because that is where it is warmest and where it is safest. No one keeps watch all night. No one stays awake to protect others through constant tension. Safety does not come from always being alert, but from knowing that if something unusual happens, it will be felt quickly by many bodies at once. Sleep, therefore, is not weakness. It is shared trust. Trust that the person beside you will wake first if needed. Trust that a strange sound will wake many at the same time. Trust that tonight will resemble last night and the night before. There are no thoughts about tomorrow, no plans laid down before drifting off. Tomorrow will arrive in its own way, just as today did. Sleep is not seen as preparation for the future. It is a way of closing the present. And as the body sinks into familiar darkness, there is no feeling of falling. Only the feeling of being held by warmth, by breathing, by the quiet presence of others. In that world, sleep is not being alone with darkness. Sleep is being together inside darkness. And for tens of thousands of years, sleeping in that way kept humans alive, so that each morning when light returned, the story could continue. From the outside, a day like this may look simple. No achievements, no obvious progress. But inside this repetition, humans preserved what mattered most: continuity. One day after another, one generation after another. Not through great leaps, but through endurance. A day in the life before civilization was not meant to create a distant future. It was meant to make sure tomorrow could still begin. And for tens of thousands of years, that was enough. We often begin every imagination of humans before civilization with a very modern question. What did they eat to stay alive? At first, that question sounds simple, but it carries a deeper assumption that their lives were always defined by lack, that food was a constant problem, that each day was a struggle not to starve. Yet, if we slow down, if we place that question back into the rhythm we have just followed, a slow morning, a midday pause, a dusk of sharing, and a night of sleeping together, the picture begins to change. For humans before civilization, food did not exist as a stream of resources that could be separated from the world around them. It was not an isolated unit to be measured and counted, and it was not something that could be extracted endlessly without consequence. Food was a relationship, and like every relationship, it required listening, adjustment, and limits. That relationship was first of all with the land. Land was not seen as a neutral surface to farm or exploit. It was an entity with memory. There were places that gave generously, and places that had to be left alone. Humans learned to read land through very small signs, the softness of the ground, the smell after rain, the kind of grass that rose first after the dry season. When the land began to tire, they left not because they had a better option, but because staying too long would break the relationship. Here there was no concept of owning land, only the concept of staying as a guest for as long as the land still allowed it. The second relationship was with the seasons. Food did not exist evenly all year. It came and went. It had a rhythm. Humans did not try to force the seasons to change. They changed themselves with the seasons. In one season they ate roots, in another fruit. There were times when hunting was frequent and times when life depended almost entirely on gathering. Accepting that change was not resignation. It was a form of deep understanding, the understanding that trying to hold a fixed rhythm of life inside a world that is always shifting is the shortest path to collapse. So seasonal hunger was not treated as catastrophe, but as a phase to pass through. And abundance, when it arrived, was never treated as permanent. The third relationship was with animals. An animal was not only meat, it was a being with behavior, with habits, with territory. To hunt, humans had to understand the paths of movement, the times of rest, when to follow and when to let go. Killing an animal was not a meaningless act. It always came with a cost: lost energy, lost time, and sometimes lost people. For that reason, hunting was not arbitrary. They did not overhunt. They did not kill simply to prove ability. When a herd disappeared, that was a sign to leave, not a reason to hunt until the last one. The final relationship, and perhaps the most important, was the relationship with the body itself. The body of a human before civilization was not separated from the environment. Hunger, fatigue, pain, recovery, all of it was information. They ate when the body needed food, not to store up for days that had not yet arrived. They stopped when the body signaled, not by forcing themselves past limits over and over. The body was not treated as a tool for extracting the world, but as the place where the world answered back. If they ate the wrong thing, the body hurt. If they did too much, the body weakened. If they ignored those signals, the price was real and fast. So the relationship with food could not be separated from the relationship with nature as a whole. Hunting is often retold as a sequence of violent action, as if it were always the dramatic climax of pre-civilized life. A tense chase, a precise spear throw, and the thin line between living and dying. But that is hunting seen from the outside, from a world used to compressing time into dramatic moments. In the lived experience of humans before civilization, most of hunting did not take the shape of climax. It happened in silence, not the silence of tension, but the silence of duration, long enough for footsteps to become steady, long enough for breathing to find its own rhythm. There were days that passed without any decisive moment at all, only movement, observation, stopping, and then continuing. The path a hunter walked was not measured by distance, but by endurance. It could stretch for hours, sometimes for days, and often ended not in victory, but in the acceptance of letting go. Hunting then was rarely a story of superior strength. Humans were not faster than most animals. They were not stronger. They had no claws to end the struggle quickly. In direct confrontation, they were almost always at a disadvantage. What humans had was time. They had the ability to walk for a very long time without needing to sprint. They had the ability to hold a steady pace while the prey was forced to constantly change. And more than anything, they had the ability not to quit when everything became dull, monotonous, and seemingly meaningless. An animal could burst into speed, but it could not sustain that state for long. Its body was designed for short explosions of movement, not for continuous duration under sun. Humans were different. Human bodies shed heat more effectively. Their steps, even slow, could repeat without draining muscle too quickly. So the hunt was not a race, it was an erosion. not erosion by violence, but erosion by rhythm. The prey was not defeated by a single decisive strike, but by time stretched long enough that it could no longer run. In that process, the hunter did not only track the animal, but tracked their own body. They knew when to speed up slightly, when to slow down, when to stop completely, so they would not push themselves into danger. Hunting in this sense was a prolonged dialogue between two bodies within the same environment. No one won immediately. No one lost immediately. There was only a difference in the ability to endure. And here we begin to see clearly a distinctly human feature of pre-civilized hunting. It did not glorify the moment, it glorified continuation. A good hunter was not the one who delivered the most beautiful strike, but the one who could keep walking when nothing interesting was happening anymore, when fatigue arrived slowly, and when the result was still far away. Hunting then did not teach humans how to win quickly. It taught humans how to remain inside time, long enough for the world to reveal its weakness. And for tens of thousands of years, it was precisely that ability, not strength, not speed, but endurance bound to time that kept humans alive. Not as conquerors of nature, but as creatures who could move with its rhythm until that rhythm slowed. An animal can run faster for a few minutes, but it cannot sustain continuous movement for hours under the sun. Its body overheats, its breath tightens, and in the end, fatigue becomes weakness. So the hunt did not end in an explosive moment, but in slow depletion. And when the animal finally fell, it was not the victory of violence, but the result of a rhythm of life carefully aligned with the environment over a long time. But hunting was not the only source of food, and in many periods it was not even the most stable one. Much of daily energy came from gathering, a kind of work rarely told, yet foundational. Gathering was not random activity. It demanded a refined system of knowledge accumulated across generations. Which roots could be eaten, which fruits could be eaten only when fully ripe, which leaves caused pain which could heal a small wound. That knowledge was not written down, not systematized into books. It was kept in collective memory, in story, in habit, and in caution. A small mistake in gathering could lead to illness. An illness in a world without medicine was a serious risk. So gathering was an activity of intense attention, not rushed, not impulsive, not reckless experimentation. When food was carried back to camp, the day did not truly close, because for humans before civilization, finding food was only the first part of a longer process, slower, more careful, a process in which anything that was about to enter the body had to pass through transformation. Meat was not eaten immediately in its raw state, and roots were never chewed in a hurry just to quiet hunger, because in that world, eating too fast could mean risk, and risk rarely offered a second chance. So food was set down, looked at in firelight, touched with bare hands, and then began to move through actions so familiar they hardly needed names. It was cut to remove parts that could not be eaten or might cause harm, pounded to break the hard structure that held energy trapped inside, roasted over fire, so heat could change its nature, making it softer, easier to digest, and most importantly, safer for the human body. Some portions were dried, not to store endlessly in a modern sense, but to extend a little longer the life of what had been painfully difficult to obtain in case tomorrow offered nothing. These actions were not about making food more appealing or more pleasant in taste. They were a way of reducing risk in a world without medicine, without chemistry, and without the ability to undo mistakes. Many foods became digestible only after being cooked. Many harmful substances were broken down only by heat. Many sources of energy were released only after their original structures had been altered. So fire was not only light or warmth to push back the cold of night. It was the most important survival tool in turning the outside world dangerous and uncertain into something the human body could take in and still remain alive. Through fire, what was once inedible became edible. What once caused pain became nourishing, and the biological limits of humans expanded not through strength, but through understanding accumulated slowly over time. The processing of food was also when the community naturally gathered around the fire, forming a warm circle where each face could be seen clearly enough to be recognized, while the darkness beyond remained as part of the world that could never be fully controlled. In that space, food was no longer an inert thing. It entered social order where questions of who brought it, who divided it, who was prioritized when there was not enough, were decided not by written law, but by a sense of fairness shaped over years of living together. And here too, the day was retold, not like a report, but like a stream of memory: who went where, who saw what, which path should not be taken again, which signs suggested the season was shifting, and that information was placed beside the food, mixed into the smell of smoke, becoming part of shared experience. Food then did not only feed bodies, it connected people-bound survival information to life itself and placed each person in their position within the circle. Only when food had been handled, shared, and placed into the right relationship with the community did the day truly end, not with absolute fullness, but with the feeling that today's world, despite its uncertainty, had been transformed just enough to allow tomorrow to arrive. When food was ready and set down in the middle of the shared circle, it rarely belonged to any one individual anymore. In the world before civilization, food was not understood as a reward for solitary effort, and it was not used to measure merit or rank human worth. It was divided not through exact calculation, not through the concept of deserving, as we commonly use it, but through a sense of fairness the community had cultivated and adjusted over time. The hunter did not keep the largest portion simply because they brought the animal down. The one who stayed at camp did not receive the smallest portion simply because they did not travel far. Today's role did not determine tomorrow's right to live. The division seen from the outside might not be perfect, not mathematically equal, but it was fair enough for the community to continue existing without quiet fractures spreading inside it. Not because people were more virtuous or more moral in a modern sense, but because personal accumulation brought no long-term advantage in a world that was always moving. Without secure storehouses, without walls, when tomorrow could force the whole group to leave food held privately, became more burden than wealth. Food that was not shared was food at risk of being lost, spoiled by sudden weather, stolen by animals that could smell it, or wiped away by an unexpected event no one could foresee. In that world, sharing was not an ethical preference. It was a survival strategy sharpened over time by lived experience. And that strategy left clear traces in the human body. The modern human body, even in a world of abundance and stability, still carries biological memory from a time when food never came from a single source. Our digestive system is adapted to diversity, to constant shifts between meat roots, fruit seeds, and leaves, rather than to a long life built on one fixed food. Our teeth are not fully meat eaters' teeth, and not purely plant eaters' teeth. They reflect a flexible diet that changed with season, terrain, and opportunity. In many excavated pre-civilized skeletons, the marks of chronic diseases common today, diseases tied to prolonged excess, do not appear clearly. Not because people then were healthier in a modern sense, but because their rhythm of life did not generate continuous accumulation of surplus. Food came and went, and the body was allowed to return to balance before things went too far. We often call that life harsh. But that is a view formed from a world accustomed to backup plans, accustomed to storage, accustomed to the ability to make many mistakes before consequences become severe. For humans before civilization, the concepts of easy and hard did not exist in the way we use them. There were only things suitable for continuing to live and things dangerous to approach. Their lives were not gentle, but they were not chaotic. They had rhythm, the rhythm of day and night, of season and land, of fatigue and recovery. They had limits recognized early and respected, because crossing them too many times would not be forgiven. And they had rules that were never written down yet were obeyed strictly through lived experience and collective memory. Humans before civilization did not live in endless abundance, but they also did not live in constant famine. They lived in a different kind of enough to keep moving, when movement was needed enough to raise children through their most vulnerable years, enough to keep the story from breaking between generations. In that world, food was not the ultimate goal of life. It was the condition that allowed the relationship between humans and the world around them to continue without collapse. And within that relationship, we begin to see a truth rarely mentioned about this distant past. Life before civilization was not a daily sprint away from death. It was a continuous negotiation, slow, careful between the body's needs, the environment's limits, and the time a human could endure. A negotiation not loud, not heroic, but enduring enough to keep our species alive for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone thought to name it with a simple word like harsh. There is a stubborn misunderstanding that clings to us when we try to imagine the mind of humans before civilization. We often assume they thought more, simply knew less, or merely reacted by instinct, as if human intelligence back then were a rough, unfinished version of what we are today. But archaeology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology suggest the opposite. The brain of a pre-civilized human was not less developed, not smaller, not simpler, and did not lack any basic functional region compared with our brains today. Biologically speaking, the brain of someone who lived tens of thousands of years ago was almost identical to ours. Similar volume, similar frontal lobe structure, and similar capacity for language processing memory and complex emotion. The difference was not a lack of ability, but a difference in operation in the cognitive architecture they used to understand and live within the world around them. Pre-civilized humans did not use their brains to manipulate large abstract systems such as law currency or administrative bureaucracy. But that does not mean their brains were used less. On the contrary, their minds were continuously mobilized for tasks that demanded high precision and immediate consequences. A hunter had to remember, at the same time, dozens of kinds of traces, the depth of a footprint, the angle at which a branch had snapped the spacing between a prey animal's steps, the slightest shift in scent within the air. That information was not processed sequentially like a calculation. It was synthesized almost instantly into a felt orientation, continue or stop, turn, left or go back. A gatherer had to distinguish hundreds of plant species, know exactly which parts were edible, which were harmful, and at what time of year a fruit became safe. A mistake here was not simply misunderstanding. It could mean prolonged illness or death. That pressure compelled the brain to develop detailed memory, tightly bound to sensation, taste, and context, a form of memory that modern people rarely have to use. Even in social life, the pre-civilized mind operated at a level of subtlety no less sophisticated. Living in a small band of a few dozen people did not simplify relationships. It demanded the ability to read emotion, anticipate reactions, and continuously maintain social balance. A small conflict that was not handled well could fracture an entire community, dangerous in a world with no replacement group. Studies of hunting and gathering societies that survived into the 19th and 20th centuries show that people in these communities often had extraordinary spatial orientation. They could travel across vast territories without maps, relying only on the sun's position, the shape of landforms, wind direction, and details modern people commonly overlook. This was not a vague instinct, but the result of a brain trained continuously in a real environment. Modern neuroscience also shows that the brain is highly plastic. It strengthens the regions it uses most often. For pre-civilized humans, that meant brain systems related to spatial cognition, long-term context-based memory, and multisensory processing were strongly engaged, while regions devoted to manipulating abstract symbols, such as reading, writing, or handling large numbers, were not yet the center. A very concrete example appears in cave art. To create images that repeat, that carry symbolic structure, and that are placed in specific locations deep inside caves, humans needed three-dimensional spatial imagination, advanced planning, and the ability to preserve images across long spans of time. This was not an impulsive behavior. It was the product of a mind capable of abstraction, only an abstraction shaped through images and lived experience, rather than through writing. Even burial rituals reveal the complexity of thought. Placing objects with the dead, choosing burial sites, and repeating certain actions across generations suggests that humans were thinking about death not only as biological ending, but as an event with social and symbolic meaning. That requires the ability to reflect beyond the present moment, something distinctly human. So to say that pre-civilized humans were less intelligent is a mistake born from applying a modern yardstick to a different cognitive structure. Their brains were not lacking. They were tuned for a different world, a world where every decision was directly linked to survival, where knowledge did not sit inside books, but inside bodies, memory, and relationship with the environment. They did not need to think about the world endlessly. They needed to feel the world correctly, and for a very long stretch of human history, that was enough. Pre-civilized humans did not stand outside nature to observe it as an object. They did not separate human from environment. Their minds did not operate with a clear boundary between inside and outside. They were in the world, not looking at the world from a distance. In that cognitive structure, the world was never silent. It was always sending signals, and the mind's task was not to analyze, but to listen. A wind was not merely air moving. It was a sign of change about to come. A strange scent in the afternoon was not only a smell, it could signal rain or the presence of predators. An unusual silence among birds was not random, but something that had to be noticed immediately. Perception, therefore, did not begin with the question, "Why is this happening?" but with the question, "What does this mean for our survival?" The pre-civilized mind was trained to recognize patterns through repetition, not to turn the world into concepts. They did not need to name a rule in order to follow it. If a behavior led to bad consequences, often enough, it disappeared. If a path was always safe in one season and dangerous in another, that memory was retained without diagrams or written notes. Knowledge in that world did not exist as independent information. It lived in the body, in the way a step stopped when it needed to, in the way a hand held a tool, without thinking in the way the whole group slowed at once when they sensed something was wrong. When humans began leaving traces on stone, on bone, and deep inside caves with little light, they did not do so to decorate living space or express a personal ego. The images appeared in places difficult to reach, inconvenient for daily life, and often far underground, suggesting they were not meant for ordinary living, but for memory. The animals drawn again and again were not precise copies of nature. They did not need perfect proportion or perspective. What mattered was that they were correct in meaning. A dangerous animal was drawn with the parts of its body that must be avoided emphasized. A familiar prey animal was drawn in the posture easiest to recognize. Image in that sense became a form of collective memory, not told in words, but held in presence. The handprints on cave walls were not simply saying someone was here. They were an assertion that humans belonged in that space, that the human body could touch the world and leave a mark. In a world without writing, without records, and without a concept of identity extending cleanly through time, a handprint was a direct way of saying life existed here, and that was enough. In this cognitive structure, everything had the potential to carry meaning. Not in a vague, mystical sense, but in a very practical, survival sense. A forest might be respected not because it was sacred, but because it had once caused loss. A valley might be avoided not because of irrational fear, but because collective memory had registered danger there. Stories were born out of that need to remember. Early myth did not aim to explain how the universe functioned. It did not answer why thunder existed or why the stars moved. It answered a different question, far more practical: what must not be forgotten. A dangerous animal became a character with clear habits and temperament, so no one would underestimate it. A fatal mistake became a story told again and again, so fear would bind itself tightly to memory. A place where someone once died became taboo space, so no one would accidentally repeat the tragedy. In this way, the world was organized without maps. Behavior was guided without written law. Order was not imposed from outside. It emerged from shared memory, carried across generations. Death in the mind of pre-civilized humans was not pushed outside life. It occurred often enough not to feel unfamiliar, but seriously enough never to be taken lightly. When someone died, the community did not only lose a body, it lost a piece of lived experience. That is why burial was not simply disposal. It was a way of keeping presence. The objects placed with the dead did not always carry practical use. They carried symbolic value. They said this person once had a role, once belonged to the group, and is still remembered. In that world, memory did not remain in the head of one individual. It spread through the community, through ritual, through story, and through the way people reacted to familiar situations. Knowing what not to do mattered as much as knowing what to do. And much of that knowledge did not need to be named. It existed as reflex, as feeling, as a familiarity very difficult to turn into words. There was no clear division between reason and emotion. Fear was not something to overcome. It was a signal to listen to. Respect was not an abstract moral concept. It was an attitude that prevented the repetition of past mistakes. The mind did not attempt to dominate the world. It sought to move in harmony with it long enough not to be eliminated. In that cognitive structure, humans did not live with the sense that they were missing something. They did not wait for a larger system to provide meaning. Meaning was already there in the land they walked each day, in the fire they lit each night, in the stories told slowly when the day closed. This chapter does not claim that pre-civilized humans understood the world more correctly than we do. It only shows that they understood it differently, without separating humans from nature, without separating knowledge from experience, and without separating life from memory. And to understand what changed when humans began to write the world down, began storing memory outside the body, and began building structures that rose above the small community, we have to keep this image, the image of a mind that never stood outside nature because it never once believed it needed to. If nature was the space that humans before civilization had to listen to every day, then community was the place where they remained. Without community, all knowledge of land seasons hunting or gathering became meaningless. An individual, no matter how skilled, could not sustain life long enough alone in a world full of uncertainty. So community was not a social structure chosen freely. It was a foundational condition for survival. Humans before civilization did not begin life as independent individuals and only later look for ways to connect. They were born in the arms of others, grew up among other bodies, and learned the world by watching relationships between people before they fully understood the relationship between themselves and nature. Community was not outside the individual. It wrapped around the individual from the very first moment. This was true not only socially, but biologically. A human child cannot survive, even briefly, on its own. It must be held, kept warm, fed, and protected continuously for many years longer than in most other species. This extended dependence shaped humans into a species that lives through community before it lives through individual skill. The first breaths did not happen in isolation. They blended into the breathing of the mother and the bodies lying close by in shared space. Heartbeats, voices, and the warmth of other people became the earliest signals of safety before the outside world even took clear shape. Safety was not a concept to be taught. It was a sensation transmitted from the community into that fragile body. Growing up inside community meant learning the world through observing relationships. Children did not learn through explanation, but by seeing who shared food with whom, who listened to whom, who stepped in when tension appeared. Before understanding how dangerous an animal could be, they learned how adults responded to danger. Before understanding land and seasons, they learned how the community adjusted its rhythm of life. Community, therefore, was the world's first filter. It spared the individual from facing the full complexity of the environment from the very beginning. Threats became smaller through shared presence. Difficult decisions were distributed, and personal mistakes, if they happened, rarely carried lethal consequences when others were still nearby. In a world without healthcare systems, without material reserves, and without outside intervention, community was the only form of social security. When someone was injured, the whole group slowed down. When someone lost strength, their role was temporarily carried by others. When a child lost a father or mother, the child did not become an orphan in any absolute sense. The child was absorbed back into the common circle. More than that, community did not only keep people alive biologically, it also kept them from breaking apart psychologically. In the pre-civilized world, there was no concept of loneliness as a prolonged condition. People slept near one another, ate together, worked within one another's sight. The feeling of abandonment, if it appeared, was usually brief and was quickly corrected by the group because prolonged separation was a danger signal for everyone. Personal identity in that context was not something constructed purely from within. It was reflected from outside. You knew who you were through the role others recognized, the one who kept the fire, the one who knew the water, the one who watched the children, the one who told stories. These identities were not fixed, but they gave each person a clear place inside the shared structure, a place that made them feel needed and held. Community was also where power was naturally limited. When everyone lived close enough to see one another every day, no one could accumulate power without being noticed. Every act of abuse left immediate traces in relationships. Surveillance did not require law. It happened through the continuous presence of others. Finally, community was where memory was preserved. When one person died, their knowledge did not vanish with them. If that knowledge had been shared, retold, repeated enough times. In that world, community was not only a collection of the living. It was the continuing chain of life itself, where past, present, and future overlapped in the smallest actions. So, to say that community was important to humans before civilization is still not enough. Community was not one element of life, it was life. Without community, there was no individual in the sense we understand the word. And it was in that shared space that humans learned how to become human long before they learned how to name it. Hunting and gathering groups were often small, rarely exceeding a few dozen people. That size was not due to a lack of ability to expand, but due to the limits of direct familiarity. In a small group, no one became invisible. Every change, a prolonged fatigue, an avoided glance, a slowed movement was seen. And in a world without hospitals, without relief, agencies being seen meant having a chance to survive. Imagine a morning in the camp. A young man does not get up with the others. No one needs to label his condition as sickness. The rhythm of his breathing, the way he turns, those are enough to know he cannot go far today. There is no scolding, no question of personal responsibility. The community adjusts on its own, someone else will go instead, or the trip will be shortened. Survival takes priority over plans. Family in that world did not take the narrow shape of the modern model. Children did not belong only to their biological parents. They belonged to the group. A child might sleep beside their mother tonight, and the next morning wake beside another woman tending the fire. That did not erase blood ties. It reduced risk. If one person fell ill, if an accident happened, the child still had other arms. There is a story recorded by anthropologists in hunting and gathering communities that survived into the 20th century. A child fell into a river while playing. It was not the child's biological mother who jumped in first, but an older man sitting nearby. He was not a hero. He was simply the closest. When the child was brought up, the child was returned to the mother. But in the memory of the group saving the child did not belong to one person. It belonged to a community that reacted quickly enough. Elders held a special place within this structure. When their bodies could no longer keep up with long journeys, they were not abandoned. They stayed closer to camp-repaired tools, watched children, and most importantly, they held memory. In a world without writing, collective memory did not live inside objects. It lived inside people. Elders were where memory stayed the longest. An older woman might no longer go far to gather, but she remembers a year long ago when the rainy season arrived early, when a path usually safe suddenly became dangerous. When she speaks slowly about it by the fire, no one dismisses it as irrelevant. That memory might decide where the group sets camp tomorrow. Power in communities like this did not exist as a fixed position. There was no lifelong ruler, no symbol of authority raised up to remind someone they were above. Power appeared by situation and disappeared when the situation passed. The person listened to today could be someone else tomorrow. When the group had to cross unfamiliar land, the one who knew the way was followed. When conflict flared, the one who stayed calm and spoke least was often heard most. When food grew scarce, the one who had lived through earlier seasons of hunger became the center of attention. Power was not given. It was temporarily acknowledged. There is a story often repeated in research on hunter-gatherer groups in Africa. A skilled hunter kept boasting about his successes, looked down on others, and tried to take a larger share. At first, the group simply stayed silent. Then they began to mock him, turning his behavior into jokes and evening stories. Finally, no one hunted with him anymore. There was no official punishment, only the community's withdrawal. In such a world, power built on intimidation or pride could not last. Conflict still happened. Humans did not become harmonious simply by living close together, but in small groups, conflict could not easily harden into a system. There was not enough distance for resentment to hide. There was no machinery to sustain prolonged violence. Tension was often eased through speech, through others stepping in, or through one person, temporarily moving away from the center of camp life, a natural cooling off. Most importantly, community operated on a principle that did not need to be spoken. The life of each person was tightly tied to the life of all. This was not a moral ideal. It was a biological reality. One person weakening slowed the whole group. A child neglected made the group's future more fragile. A prolonged conflict drained energy no one had in excess. Personal identity, therefore, was not built through isolated achievement. It was built through role in the shared continuation. You are the one who finds water. You are the one who keeps the fire. You are the one who tells stories when night falls. These roles were not permanent, but they gave each person a clear place inside the group. Knowing you are needed in some way is a deep form of psychological safety. Extended family, flexible power, and bonded community formed a system that was imperfect yet durable. It did not eliminate suffering, but it spread it out. It did not prevent death, but it reduced loneliness when death drew near. In a world without written law, without a state, and without coercive institutions, these close relationships kept order from dissolving. This chapter does not describe an ideal society. It describes a society constrained by reality where no one could stand too high and no one could fall too low without being seen. A society where family did not close in to endure alone, but opened outward to endure together. And a society where power was not accumulated into symbols, but dissolved and reappeared according to the needs of life. From these small, fragile adaptive structures, humans moved together through tens of thousands of years long before written law, long before family was narrowed into a rigid frame, and long before power had an official name. And to understand why the larger structures of civilization that came later were both powerful and dangerous, we must remember that the foundations of humanity were once built not from stone or writing, but from relationships close enough that no one could be forgotten. If community was the place where people stayed, then migration was how they continued to exist. For humans before, civilization movement was not an exceptional event, nor was it the failure of a place. It was the breathing rhythm of life, arriving and leaving, pausing and moving on according to rules that did not need to be written down yet, were always remembered. Pre-civilized humans did not live in a stable world, and they did not cling to the illusion that the world had to be stable for them to endure. Climate was always in motion, following long and short cycles layered over one another, like waves no one could separate. Some changes unfolded so slowly that they were only recognized after many seasons had passed, and some disruptions arrived quickly, without warning, forcing people to respond before they even had words for what was happening. Temperatures could rise and fall without any clear reason, and that uncertainty was not an exception to be explained away, but a condition to be lived with. A winter that stretched longer than memory suggested was not treated as an anomaly. It was understood as one of the many shapes the world could take. The rainy season might arrive early, soaking the land before seeds were ready, or come too late when the ground had already hardened and cracked. Sometimes it failed to arrive at all, leaving behind dry riverbeds that still carried the memory of water in their curves. Familiar rivers could quietly abandon their old paths, carving new ones elsewhere, and grasslands that had fed large herds year after year could fall silent after a single brutal season. In such a world, continuity was fragile. The past offered guidance, but never guarantees. Memory was not a promise that things would repeat themselves. It was a tool for comparison, a way to notice when something had begun to drift. What mattered was not remembering how the world used to be, but recognizing when it was no longer behaving that way. Memory had value only, insofar as it helped people adjust their actions in the present. When memory turned into attachment, when it became a reason to stay despite mounting signs, it lost its usefulness and became dangerous. This is why staying too long was not considered a virtue. It was not resilience, not courage, and certainly not loyalty to a place. More often, it was a quiet failure of perception. A group that remained simply because a place had once been generous, once been familiar, once sustained them through earlier seasons, was no longer responding to the world as it was. They were responding to an image of the world that no longer existed. In doing so, they were trading adaptability for comfort and survival for habit. In a shifting climate, endurance did not mean holding on at all costs. It did not mean proving toughness by outlasting worsening conditions. Endurance meant preserving the ability to continue, not here, not now, but somewhere else later. It meant recognizing that strength lay not in stubbornness, but in timing. Knowing when to let go was not a retreat. It was a form of intelligence sharpened by experience. Letting go required discipline of a different kind. It meant accepting that a place could be good and still need to be left. It meant releasing the emotional weight of familiarity, the shelters repaired again and again, the paths worn smooth by repeated steps, the memories embedded in particular stones or trees. It meant understanding that attachment, when it outlived usefulness, could pull a group into exhaustion long before hunger or cold became visibly catastrophic. For pre-civilized humans, resilience was measured not by how long they could endure decline, but by how early they could recognize it. The world did not announce collapse with a single dramatic event. It signaled through accumulation, water running lower, animals moving differently, plants failing in subtle ways. To ignore those signs was not bravery, it was blindness. To respond to them, to move before desperation set in, was how life was preserved. In this sense, movement was not a rejection of place, but a respect for it. Leaving allowed the land time to recover. It acknowledged limits rather than attempting to overpower them, and it kept open the most important resource of all choice. As long as people could still choose to move, they had not yet lost the future. Migration, therefore, was not running away from hardship. It was the result of a long, quiet process of observation. No one decided to leave because of a single hot day or one strange rain. The decision formed when enough small signs stacked on top of one another, water shrinking faster than in previous years, animals appearing less often, plants flowering but not fruiting, winds changing direction at times that were usually predictable. These changes were not recorded in numbers, but in a shared feeling that the world was slipping out of its old rhythm. To read signals correctly was not to predict the distant future. It was to recognize when the present could no longer be trusted. It meant distinguishing between temporary difficulty and a deeper shift. One weak rainy season did not necessarily force a departure, but 2 or 3 signs appearing together could be a warning that staying would drain the group before it could adjust. What matters is that this reading of signals did not belong to a single individual. There was no prophet who declared the moment of migration. The decision formed through a consensus of sensation when many people saw, felt, and adjusted their behavior in the same direction. The walking rhythm slowed. Long forays became shorter. Food began to be shared more cautiously. And then almost naturally, everyone understood that this place was closing, In that sense, migration was an act of understanding, not of fear. It did not arise from panic or desperation, but from a deep familiarity with how the world behaved over time. To migrate was to trust one's capacity to read the present more than to rely on the comfort of remembered seasons. It meant accepting that memory, while valuable, could also mislead if treated as a promise rather than a reference. The world had changed before, and it would change again. Wisdom lay in noticing when the old patterns no longer held. This kind of movement required a very particular courage, not the dramatic courage of confrontation, but the quieter courage of departure. Leaving what is familiar is always costly, even when the familiar has become unsafe. Paths are known, shelters repaired, places named through repeated use. To walk away from them meant stepping into uncertainty without any guarantee of improvement. Yet pre-civilized humans understood something fundamental. Remaining in a place that no longer sustained life was more dangerous than venturing into the unknown, while strength still remained. Moving at the right time preserved agency. Staying too long surrendered it. In a world without climate forecasts, without long-term maps, and without institutions capable of absorbing failure, there was no margin for prolonged misjudgment. A serious mistake could not be corrected later by technology or stored surplus. Migration was therefore not a gamble for better fortune, but a strategy to avoid irreversible loss. It did not promise abundance on the next horizon. It promised only the continuation of choice, the ability to respond again if conditions demanded it. Keeping the future open did not mean planning it in detail. It meant refusing to close it prematurely. By leaving before desperation set in, people ensured that they traveled with energy cohesion and flexibility. They arrived in new places, able to observe, to adapt, and if necessary, to move again. A group that migrated early carried options with them. A group that waited until collapse carried only exhaustion. This way of living demanded constant attentiveness. Signals had to be weighed together, not in isolation. One bad season could be endured. A pattern of subtle failures could not. The ability to read those patterns, water levels, animal behavior, plant cycles, wind shifts, became a collective skill refined over generations. It was not prediction in the modern sense, but calibration aligning human movement with the changing rhythms of the land. Through this capacity, humans avoided becoming trapped in dead lands, places that could no longer support life, but continued to hold people through habit or attachment. They survived not by imposing permanence on an unstable world, but by matching its fluidity. Movement was not resistance to change. It was cooperation with it. And over tens of thousands of years, this willingness to move, guided by understanding rather than fear, allowed humans to persist across climates, continents, and upheavals long before stability ever became an aspiration. Those signals were rarely dramatic. They arrived as small things, water falling faster than usual, grass growing shorter, animals thinning out, or winds shifting on afternoons that had always followed a familiar pattern. No one needed to announce, "It's time to go." The decision to move often formed in silence when enough people sensed the same thing. This place no longer gives the way it used to. A constantly mobile life did not mean a directionless one. People did not wander at random. They moved within familiar territories, drawn, not with borders, but with memory. Old routes were used again. Safe water stops were remembered carefully. Places that had once brought danger were avoided. Space in this way was held as a living map, changing with the seasons but never vanishing. Climate played a central role in that rhythm of movement. During ice ages and interglacial periods, the world kept contracting and opening again. When it grew colder, humans followed animals south. When it warmed, they expanded their range. Human movement was tied to the movement of ecosystems, not by command, but by dependence. Imagine a group leaving camp at the end of the dry season. They do not carry much. There is nothing too heavy to abandon. Tools are chosen with care. Anything unnecessary is left behind without regret. In that world, the ability to leave quickly is a form of safety. Lightness is not deprivation, it is strategy. Children are carried not to overprotect them, but to keep the group's shared rhythm. Elders walk more slowly, and the whole group slows with them. No one is left behind because separation is a greater risk than any advantage gained by speed. Migration, therefore, is not the act of the strongest individual. It is the shared tempo of a community. There are places people return to year after year. There are places they visit once and never again. Return is not based on ownership, but on temporary fit. If the land still gives, they stay. If it does not, they move on. There is no fixed notion of homeland in the modern sense, only places that were once safe, and places that are no longer suitable. A mobile life also reshapes how people think about time. There is no long-term planning measured in years or decades. The future is not stored in granaries, but in the ability to adapt. Preparation does not mean accumulation. It means knowing when to leave, knowing what to carry, and knowing what to leave behind without regret. This also shapes the relationship with objects. Tools must be durable, but not too heavy. Possessions must be versatile, but not overly complex. Things that require staying in one place for a long time struggle to find a place in this way of living. Value is not in owning more, but in owning what is right. Migration also deeply affects social structure. No one can accumulate power by controlling land because land is not fixed. No one can hold a long-term advantage by hoarding resources because resources shift with the seasons. Power, if it exists at all, is tied to the knowledge of movement, knowing routes, knowing timing, knowing how to read climate signals. Those who hold this role do not rule. They are listened to when hard decisions must be made, and they drift away from the center when circumstances change. Continuous mobility prevents power from hardening into a system. Any rigid structure becomes fragile in a world that must leave often. A migratory life also thins the boundaries between groups. Where routes cross, people meet. They exchange information where water remains, where danger waits, which direction to take this season. Sometimes they exchange partners, creating bonds that extend beyond a single small band. Migration, therefore, does not only scatter humans, it connects them along shared pathways. In a volatile climate, the ability to read signs becomes a survival skill. Unusual cold is not just sensation, it is information. A late rainy season is not merely discomfort. It forces the whole group to adjust its movement rhythm. The human mind, as we saw in the previous chapter, is trained to link such changes to concrete decisions. There is no such thing as a small mistake in reading climate. Staying too long can drain the entire group. Leaving too early can push them into land that is not ready. That is why migration is the product of shared perception, not of command. When enough people see the same signs, the decision forms. The night before departure is often quieter. The fire is kept small. Belongings are packed neatly. There is no grand farewell ritual, because leaving is not an ending. It is continuation. The next morning, the old camp becomes empty, quickly. Traces are softened, not out of abstract reverence for nature, but because people know they may return, and if they return, the place must have a chance to recover. Migration stretched across tens of thousands of years carved a particular sense of the world into humans, The world belongs to no one, and no one belongs to a single place forever. This does not create constant anxiety. It creates the ability to release. Release a place when it no longer fits. Release a plan when conditions change. Release the idea that stability is the natural state. This chapter does not tell the story of heroic caravans crossing continents. It speaks of small steps, repeated, patient, enduring steps that spread humanity across the world without maps, without central guidance, without any goal of conquest. Migration is not a secondary force in history. It is the engine. And when humans later begin to settle, to accumulate, and to fix power in place, this deep foundation of movement will become something both forgotten and quietly resistant. Because beneath everything, the human body and mind were shaped by tens of thousands of years of walking a memory older than any city, any border, any state. The way of life of pre-civilized humans was not organized around ideas of progress or development, but around a far quieter aim continuing to exist without breaking the rhythm of the world. They did not live to expand without limit, nor to accumulate beyond their needs. Their lives operated according to a logic different from the modern one, a logic of sufficiency, of continual adjustment, and of knowing when to act and when to stop. Each day did not begin with long-term plans, but with observation, whether the morning light was strong or weak, whether the wind carried a familiar scent or a strange one, whether the body that day had enough strength to travel far. Work was not rigidly divided into fixed hours, but shifted with the seasons, with circumstances, and with the condition of each person in the group. Some days the whole group moved a great deal. Other days they stayed in place, repaired tools, rested, and watched. Rest was not a reward after labor. It was an essential part of the rhythm of life, because overexertion today meant weakness tomorrow, and in a world without reserves, even a small weakening could become dangerous. Pre-civilized humans lived close to one another, not because they lacked a sense of privacy, but because closeness was a condition of safety. Sleeping near one another helped preserve warmth, detect danger, and reduce the feeling of abandonment in the dark. Living space was not divided into functional rooms. Children, adults, and elders all existed within one another's sight. The continuous presence of others was not seen as intrusion, but as assurance that no one would vanish into silence. Children grew up not through lectures or classrooms, but through repetition. They watched adults tend fires each day. They observed how tools were used, how food was processed, how silence fell when danger appeared. Play was not for entertainment, but for testing the body against the world, running, climbing, falling, standing back up, learning one's own limits. There was no sharp boundary between children's time and adults' time. Learning happened continuously through proximity. Adults did not possess identities bound to fixed professions. Roles shifted with circumstance. Today, someone hunted. Tomorrow, that same person might remain in camp because of fatigue injury or the need to care for children. The value of an individual was not measured by constant productivity, but by appropriateness in each moment. A person might contribute little physical labor, yet be vital, because they knew the routes, the seasons, or held the group's memory. Elders were not pushed out of the rhythm of life when their bodies slowed. They stayed near the center of camp, where the fire was kept, where children played, where stories were told. When paths no longer needed remembering, they remembered seasons. When hunting was no longer possible, they carried the memory of difficult years past. Lived experience was not replaced by speed or strength, but preserved as a layer of protection for the whole group. Food was not treated as a resource to be maximized, but as a relationship to be maintained. Hunting and gathering unfolded through long patience rather than dramatic moments. Most of the time was spent walking, waiting, watching. When food was brought back, it rarely belonged to an individual. It was shared not by precise calculation, but according to a sense of fairness cultivated by the community over time. Sharing was not a moral ideal. It was a survival strategy because individual accumulation offered no long-term advantage in a world that was always on the move. In the evening, as light weakened, the rhythm shifted again. Heavy work stopped. Attention narrowed toward a closer circle. A fire was lit, not only to provide warmth or ward off animals, but to create a center where people gathered and the world was held within control. In firelight, faces became clearer, voices carried farther, and memory began to surface. Stories were told not merely for entertainment, but for remembrance, which places were dangerous, which mistakes should not be repeated, what deserved respect. Night was not the frightening void modern people often imagine. It was part of the cycle. Pre-civilized humans did not try to kill time at night. They were in it, sleeping together, listening to the sounds of the world around them. They did not separate themselves from darkness, but learned to live alongside it. Safety did not come from eliminating fear entirely, but from knowing that one did not face it alone. This entire way of life was neither gentle nor romantic. There was hunger, cold, and loss. But there was rhythm, there were limits, and there was a capacity for self-adjustment without the need for large structures. Pre-civilized humans did not live in constant deprivation, nor in abundance. They lived in a different kind of enough to keep going, enough to raise children, enough to pass stories to the next generation. In that way of life, humans did not seek to rise above nature, nor above one another. They sought to stand in the right place within a world always in motion. And it was precisely this fit, not perfect, not absolutely stable, but flexible and connected, that allowed humanity to persist for tens of thousands of years, long before any concept of civilization, progress, or development was ever named. In the world before civilization, departure was neither hidden nor pushed out of daily life. It appeared as nightfall does, as the cold season does, as sudden hunger does not, because people awaited it, but because there was no way to separate themselves from it. When someone ceased responding to the breath of the world, it happened within shared space among familiar faces beneath the same sky that person had lived under. There was no distance great enough to turn that moment into abstraction, and no structure to shield the community from facing the loss directly. This parting was not private in the modern sense. It was witnessed not as intrusion, but as a way of collectively bearing the weight of a presence that had vanished. In a migratory life, when someone stepped out of the shared rhythm, order did not collapse. The community slowed, work paused, attention gathered around a single point, as if the group needed time to recognize that a gap had opened and that this gap needed to be acknowledged before life could continue. The one who had departed did not leave communal life immediately. They remained for a short while in familiar space. The body was covered, sat beside, touched, not because of mystical belief, but because people needed time to feel that this silence was different from other silences. In many hunter-gatherer communities recorded by anthropology, farewell was not rushed. It was not a problem to be handled quickly, but a reality to be stayed with until the community was ready to release it. Placing the body into the earth when it occurred was often simple. A shallow pit, a familiar place, a few objects associated with the role the person once held, not wealth, but traces of a life that had been useful to the group. Elsewhere, the body might be returned to nature in a place the community felt was appropriate. Forms differed, but the constant was collective presence at the moment of parting. The departed were not treated as impure, nor elevated into distant symbols. They remained part of the shared story, simply no longer participating in its next chapter. For those who stayed behind, grief was not isolated. There was no requirement to stabilize emotions quickly, no pressure to return immediately to routine. The community adjusted on its own. Work was shared more lightly. Food was distributed more generously to those closest to the one who had gone. Loss was not contained within a private ritual. It spread like a shared quiet, seeping into every small activity of daily life. When humans began to settle, the place of departure in life gradually changed. It did not disappear, but it no longer lay at the center of the shared rhythm as before. Staying in one place over time meant accumulation, division, and order. Within that order, each absence became not only an emotional event, but a disruption that needed organizing. Who would take over unfinished work? Who would hold land stores, former roles? Farewell began to carry questions that migratory life had never needed to ask. From there, parting customs grew more complex, not only to say goodbye, but to affirm that order continued to function. Spaces for those who had left were gradually separated from living space. Shared rhythms could no longer slow for long. Production had to continue. Systems had to remain stable. And within that necessity, sorrow slowly became the responsibility of the family, no longer the pause of the entire community. Departure shifted from a collectively absorbed event into a personal gap within a world that could not stop. This does not make modern humans less humane. It reflects a structure that has grown too large, too complex, and too rigid to bend around individual loss in the way small communities once could. Modern systems depend on continuity. Work must resume. Schedules must be kept. Institutions cannot slow their rhythm without consequence. In such a structure, grief is no longer something the whole world pauses to hold. It becomes something that must be managed quietly, efficiently, and often alone. From this growth emerges a paradox that defines the modern relationship with loss. People today encounter departure less directly than any generation before them. It is buffered by distance, by institutions, by professionals, by walls and procedures designed to contain disruption. Yet when departure arrives in their own lives, it often brings disproportionate confusion and fear. Not because people feel less, but because they feel without a shared container. What is pushed far from daily life becomes unfamiliar, and what is unfamiliar becomes harder to name, harder to touch, harder to integrate when it finally demands attention. In earlier worlds, departure was woven into the visible fabric of life. It was witnessed. It was shared. It unfolded in spaces that everyone already inhabited. Because it was not hidden, it did not need to be explained away. It had a place. In the modern world, departure is often relocated to the margins, into specialized spaces, regulated moments, private rooms. The living continue moving forward, while loss remains behind, suspended in a separate emotional register. This separation creates a silence around grief that can feel heavier than grief itself. How humans part reflects how they live together. When life is bound to small, flexible communities, departure is shared not as an act of compassion alone, but as a necessity. No one can carry loss alone without weakening the whole. When life is bound to large fixed structures, departure fragments, grief becomes individualized because the structure cannot accommodate collective pause. The system survives by moving on, even if individuals have not. And when sorrow becomes private, it often becomes unspeakable. Not because language has failed, but because there is no longer a shared rhythm into which sorrow can settle. People may feel that their grief is excessive or inconvenient or out of proportion to the pace of the world around them. They may feel pressure to recover, to move forward, to rejoin the flow, as if nothing fundamental has shifted. In doing so, loss is not erased, but it is internalized. If today many people feel that their sorrow is too quiet, too isolated, that it unfolds in a space where no one quite knows how to stand beside them, this may not be personal weakness. It may be the echo of a much older expectation carried within the human nervous system, an expectation formed over tens of thousands of years, in which departure was never faced alone, and in which those who remained were never asked to bear absence in isolation. It may be the memory of a species that once knew how to slow together, how to gather around a gap without rushing to close it, how to let absence be acknowledged before life continued. And perhaps the discomfort modern humans feel around loss is not a failure to adapt, but a signal, a quiet reminder of an older way of being human, in which no one was required to grieve in silence, and no one was expected to return to the world unchanged, while the world pretended nothing had happened. In that sense, grief today is not only about what has been lost. It is also about what has been forgotten, the shared holding of absence, and the understanding that a world which cannot pause for loss may continue to function, but at the cost of leaving its people alone with the weight of it. There was no single day marked as the first day of civilization. No morning when people woke up, knowing that from that moment on they had left an old world behind and stepped into a new one. The transition did not unfold like a door thrown open, nor like a sudden revolution. It happened far more slowly, like a path worn thin beneath familiar footsteps, so gradually that only after traveling very far could one turn around and realize that the landscape behind had changed. For a very long time, migration remained the dominant rhythm of life. Humans read the world through continuous attention, not through fixed plans. They watched the ground to know when it began to harden beneath their feet. They listened to water to sense when its flow weakened or shifted direction. They observed herds not only to hunt, but to understand how the world itself was moving. When grass thinned, when animals grew scarce, when the wind carried unfamiliar scents, no longer aligned with memory, they understood that this place was closing. The ability to let go of a place was not a lack of attachment. It was a different kind of loyalty to life itself, rather than to location. Leaving was not seen as loss, because their world was not built around fixed points. What mattered was not land, but the people who moved together. As long as the community remained intact, places could change without breaking the structure of life. But then in a few places, very few within the vastness of that world, nature began to behave differently, not dramatically, but with a repetition steady enough to create a rare sense of stability. There were valleys where sediment was deposited each year with remarkable regularity, not so much as to cause destructive floods, not so little as to exhaust the soil. There were riverbanks that overflowed on cycles almost predictable, leaving behind dark, soft earth, rich with nutrients. In those places, humans began to notice something new. The world did not only give and withdraw unpredictably. Sometimes it repeated itself. Seeds fell, sprouted, grew, and fell again in the same places. Plants emerged from the same patches of ground. Animals returned along familiar routes. The seasons were not perfectly stable, but they were consistent enough for human memory to hold on to. That repetition mattered. It created a feeling that the future for the first time was not entirely opaque. Uncertain, but imaginable. Not completely safe, but partially predictable. In a world where most survival depended on rapid response to uncertainty, predictability offered a powerful advantage. At first, this advantage was not understood as an opportunity to change the structure of life. It was simply felt as relief. Staying a little longer was no longer excessively risky. Waiting one more season did not automatically mean exhaustion. Journeys shortened. Movements became less frequent. No one declared, "We will stay." There was simply no longer an urgent reason to leave. That absence of urgency opened a new possibility. When people were no longer constantly preparing to move, they began doing things that only made sense if they stayed clearing land more carefully, saving good seeds, repairing shelters instead of abandoning them each season. These actions were still small, cautious, but they marked a profound shift in how humans related to place. Here, nature was not conquered. It was read differently. Humans did not force the land to give more. They recognized that some places were willing to give steadily. And in recognizing that migration, though still present, ceased to be the only way to survive. The world had not become stable. Climate could still betray. Rivers could still change course. But in those rare locations, humans felt for the first time that staying was no longer an act of resistance against nature, but an act of moving with a new rhythm of repetition within it. And from that fragile realization, a long, slow, irreversible chain of changes began. At first, no one believed this would alter the structure of life. No one possessed concepts like agriculture settlement or civilization. People simply did something very small, very reasonable. They stayed a little longer. They stayed to wait for seeds to ripen. They stayed to avoid traveling far in one season. They stayed to conserve strength in a world that always demanded more than bodies could easily give. That decision was not wrong. It was entirely rational in an unstable climate. It offered rare reassurance, knowing that tomorrow there would still be something to eat in the same place. But within that rationality, a deeper shift began to form, quiet, unintentional, yet powerful enough to change how humans existed. When people stayed long enough, they began investing in place. They cleared stones from the ground. They leveled small patches of soil. They saved good seeds for the next season. These actions were initially supportive, not controlling. But gradually, the future was no longer held entirely in the ability to move. It was placed into the ground at a fixed point. And when the future was placed in one location, the old rhythm began to thin, not disappearing immediately, but losing its central role. Previously, movement was how humans adjusted to climate. When land failed, they left. When animals thinned, they moved on. When wind shifted, they understood the place no longer fit. The world changed, and humans changed with it by leaving. Now adjustment began to reverse direction. Humans did not merely read signals from land water and seasons, they began intervening lightly to keep those signals in place. Stones were cleared so seeds could be planted more easily. Water was diverted slightly to irrigate the same patch. Crops were preserved, propagated, replanted in the same locations. Not extensively, not aggressively, not to dominate nature, but simply to extend the ability to remain one more season. These changes were small, but they reversed the relationship. Before humans adapted, by moving. Now they adapted by fixing themselves in place. And fixation demanded things that migratory life had never required. Staying meant protecting. When food was no longer scattered across wide spaces, but concentrated in one plot, it became easier to lose. Animals could come. Other people could come. Even those who once shared routes and water sources could become threats when survival became tied to a single place. Fences emerged not as symbols of power, but as instinctive responses to vulnerability. Guarding appeared not because humans became aggressive, but because they now had something to lose. For the first time, humans needed to clearly define what was theirs and what belonged to others, not along temporary crossings, but within daily living space. Land was no longer something passed through. It became something that had to be held. And when land must be held, boundaries blurred or sharp begin to form. Staying also meant storing. In migratory life, food was carried lightly used, quickly shared, evenly, because it could not be kept long. In settled life, seeds had to be saved for the next season. Food had to be stored for days yet to come. Storage emerged not only as preservation, but as a promise to the future that tomorrow would not depend entirely on chance. But with storage came a new anxiety. No longer the vague fear of storms, droughts, or predators' forces that came and went, but a very specific human concern who controls the storehouse, who may open it, who decides when there is not enough for everyone. Once food accumulated, sharing could no longer rely solely on immediate fairness. It required rules. And wherever rules exist, decision-making power appears. Scarcity also changed shape. Before, hunger signaled the need to leave. Now hunger became a problem to be endured in place. Staying meant facing the consequences of a failed season long term. Hunger was no longer a brief phase between movements. It could persist, accumulate, and be distributed unevenly among those living side by side. These changes did not occur because humans suddenly became greedy or violent. They emerged because the new structure of life allowed and required questions that had never existed before. When the future was placed into the ground, humans sowed not only crops, but new anxieties tied to the inability to leave easily. From these concrete concerns, protection, storage boundaries, decision-making, larger structures of civilization began to form. Not as moral choices, but as logical consequences of staying too long in one place. For the first time, humans feared future scarcity, not because nature warned of danger, but because their future had become bound to a single location. When leaving was no longer easy, every failure became heavier. A lost season was no longer a signal to move on. It was a crisis to be endured. In migratory life, power could not easily solidify. No one could maintain advantage long when the group kept moving. But in settled life, power began to take form. Who holds the seeds? Who decides distribution? Who guards the storehouse at night? These questions had not existed before. Now they became central to social life. Families began to change shape. In mobile life, children belonged to the group. Care was shared to reduce risk. When food tied to land and land tied to control, families narrowed around a house, a store, a bloodline. Bonds remained, but circles closed. Collective responsibility gave way to private obligation. Elders, once central for remembering routes, seasons, and dangerous places, gradually lost part of their role. When travel diminished, memory of old paths lost value. New knowledge rose instead, counting seasons, tracking yields, managing storage. Lived experience gave way to administrative skill. As memory ceased to reside fully in people, it began to be placed outside them. Marks appeared. Early scratches were not for storytelling or myth, but for counting recording debts, marking ownership. Writing in its earliest form did not arise from a need to describe the world, but from a need to manage it. Time changed as well. Before, time was felt through light seasons movement. Now time became calendar, planting cycles, deadlines. In migratory life, a failed season meant leaving. In settled life, failure meant staying and enduring. Staying meant hunger was no longer temporary. It could span seasons. It could accumulate in empty stores, and it could be distributed unevenly. From here, inequality emerged, not because humans became worse, but because the structure allowed disparity to persist long enough to feel normal. The moment of loss was not the act of farming itself, nor the decision to build shelters that lasted longer than a season. Those were practical responses to particular conditions. The deeper loss lay elsewhere, in losing the freedom to leave without paying an unbearable price. In losing the ability to loosen one's grip on a place when that place no longer fit the rhythm of life. In losing the lightness that came from knowing that survival did not depend on defending a single point on the map. In a mobile world, departure was a form of adjustment. Leaving did not mean collapse. It meant response. A place that failed was not a moral failure nor a personal one. It was simply information. The world had shifted and the body followed. But once life became anchored, leaving turned into rupture. Fields could not be carried. Stored grain could not be lifted onto backs without loss. Homes built with care became weight rather than shelter. To move now meant abandoning not just a location, but accumulated labor, deferred hopes, and future security. Staying even when conditions worsened often felt safer than walking away from everything that had been invested. With that shift, life grew heavier. Not heavier in an emotional sense alone, but structurally heavier. Decisions began to echo further into the future. A single failed harvest no longer dissolved into movement. It lingered. It had consequences that stretched across seasons, across generations. Mistakes no longer ended when the group moved on. They settled into the soil alongside the people who made them. In return, humans gained much. The ability to stay allowed populations to grow beyond what constant movement could support. Children survived in greater numbers. Knowledge accumulated in tools that could not have been carried easily from place to place. Techniques refined themselves over time because they were repeated in the same locations. Villages emerged where paths once crossed briefly. Villages expanded into towns into cities. From these dense concentrations of people and effort arose institutions, rules, leadership structures, shared projects that exceeded the capacity of any single group on the move. States' laws and administrative systems did not appear because humans suddenly desired hierarchy or control. They emerged because fixed life required coordination at a scale that memory and face-to-face relationships could no longer manage. When hundreds, then thousands of people depended on the same stores of food, the same water sources, the same boundaries, informal agreements were no longer sufficient. Systems stepped in where personal knowledge ended. Civilization in this sense was not an invention so much as an adaptation to scale. But the cost of that adaptation was profound. Humans began to live inside structures that exceeded their direct perception. No one could see the entire system anymore. No one could know all the people upon whom their survival depended. Trust shifted away from individuals and toward abstractions, granaries, records, ledgers, laws, institutions. Survival became mediated. One no longer relied on the immediate attentiveness of a small group, but on the assumption that the system would continue to function as intended. And when such systems failed, they failed differently. In a migratory world, failure was often local and self-limiting. A depleted area was left behind. Hunger signaled movement. The damage, while real, rarely spread far. In a settled world, failure could cascade. A broken distribution system could starve people who lived next to full fields. A poor decision at the top could affect lives far removed from its origin. When systems broke, they did not simply inconvenience. They amplified loss across distances and populations that could no longer escape together. With settlement, humans gained permanence, growth, and complexity, but they also lost immediacy. They lost the ability to respond with their feet. They lost the safety valve of departure. And in that loss, they entered a new kind of vulnerability, one not rooted in the unpredictability of nature alone, but in the fragility of the structures they themselves had built. This is not a story of progress betrayed, nor of a golden past destroyed. It is the story of an exchange. Mobility for stability, flexibility for control. Small risks repeated often for large risks endured together. Civilization did not simply add layers to human life. It rearranged its foundations. And the tension many people still feel today between the desire to stay and the urge to leave, between security and restlessness, may be the echo of that ancient trade still resonating within bodies shaped by a far longer history of movement than of walls. This chapter does not tell civilization as triumphant victory or tragic fall. It marks a long, slow turning when humans traded adaptability for control, movement for accumulation, direct relation to the world for substitute structures. And if today, within fixed cities and tight schedules, we still feel vague tension at being held too long in one place, if we feel unexpected relief at leaving, starting again elsewhere, this may not be merely modern dissatisfaction. It may be the ancient memory of a species that lived tens of thousands of years by not staying too long. Anywhere a memory still embedded deep within the body, even as the world around it has changed beyond recognition. There was never a moment when humans stopped and asked with full clarity, what are we about to trade away? The largest bargains in history rarely arrive as conscious decisions. They happen little by little through reasonable choices, short-term solutions and adjustments that seem harmless. And only when the consequences have hardened into structure do people realize that some things can no longer be brought back. When humans began to stay, they did not trade away freedom all at once. They only traded away the ease of leaving. And in a world once organized around movement, that was a change deeper than any invention. Before civilization, safety did not come from controlling the environment. It came from not being bound to that environment. Humans did not try to make soil, permanently fertile, game permanently abundant, or climate permanently stable. They accepted that the world changes, and they survived by changing with it. If the land dried out, they left. If game grew scarce, they moved on. If the climate slipped into an unfamiliar rhythm, they adjusted by traveling, carrying very little, but enough to continue. Danger in that world did not disappear. Illness, accidents, hunger, these were real. But such risks rarely accumulated long enough to become burdens that stretched across generations. A wrong choice usually had a short reach. A place becoming unsafe was a signal to leave, not a sentence to endure. Flexibility in space was the strongest protective mechanism humans possessed. Movement, therefore, was not a sign of instability. It was a survival pressure valve. When stress rose in one place through climate depletion conflict, that valve opened. People escaped the dangerous point before damage could accumulate. There was no long-term trapped condition because there was no structure forcing them to remain. When settlement began, that mechanism slowly disappeared. humans stopped moving with the world. They began to anchor themselves, anchored to cleared ground, anchored to sown seeds, anchored to stored grain, anchored to houses they had built. And when you anchor yourself to one point, every shift in the world, however small, no longer passes beside you. It strikes directly into bodies, families, and social structure. An erratic rainy season was no longer a signal to keep going. It became a direct threat to the storehouse. A long, cold spell could no longer be avoided by movement. It had to be endured in place. When people could no longer leave easily, danger did not vanish, it stayed. And when danger stays, it begins to accumulate. The freedom to move had once released pressure. When that valve closed, pressure lost its natural outlet. It was forced inward into storage, into distribution decisions, into power relations, into family structure. A failed season did not only bring short-term hunger, it could shake the social order. A bad decision no longer drifted away with the next migration. It left consequences that could last years, even generations. Safety changed form. It was no longer the ability to step away from danger. It became the effort to prevent danger from happening at all. Humans began to build fences, dig canals, store surplus, impose control. These actions were not wrong. They were rational responses to the loss of escape through movement. But they also created a new kind of fragility, the fragility of systems that must function continuously in order to keep life from collapsing. In migratory life, if a strategy failed, people left it behind with the old place. In settled life, if a strategy failed, people had to repair it where they stood while still suffering its consequences. Pressure was no longer released into space. It was compressed inside society. That is why many major instabilities of civilization do not come from single disasters, but from the accumulation of small distortions inside a system that can no longer retreat. When leaving is no longer easy, every decision carries more weight, and every failure leaves a deeper scar. What humans traded then was not only freedom of movement, but a way of managing risk that had been highly effective for tens of thousands of years. In exchange, they gained the ability to build, accumulate, and control on an unprecedented scale. But the price was living within structures where pressure could no longer be dissolved by distance, only handled internally through rules, power, and systems. And perhaps when modern people feel exhausted by accumulated pressures with no clear exit, that is not only a problem of the present age. It is the long consequence of the moment when the old safety valve closed, and we have been learning ever since how to live in a world where leaving is no longer easy. One of the first things humans traded was the lightness of ownership. In migratory life, objects had to be few, durable, and discardable. No one carried too much because everything had to travel with the body. Value was not in having more, but in having the right necessities. With settlement, objects began to stay. Storage appeared. Accumulation became rational. And with it, the fear of loss became constant. When there is something to lose, humans begin to defend. This is not a moral reflex. It is a survival reflex. Fences did not appear because people suddenly became selfish. They appeared because the world around them had changed shape. When food tools in the future were placed in one spot, protecting that spot became unavoidable. A fence at first glance is only a physical structure, but in truth, it does something far deeper. It redraws the social world. It creates a clear boundary between inside and outside, between those with access and those without. And from that spatial boundary, a psychological boundary slowly forms us and the others. In migratory life, strangers rarely carried long-lasting threat. They came and went like the moving people themselves. Meeting strangers was a chance to exchange information where water remained, where danger waited which direction to travel this season. Conflict could happen, but it rarely hardened into long-term hostility because no one was bound to remain beside one another forever. In settled life, that logic reversed. Strangers did not merely pass through. They might stay or return. When resources are tied to a fixed location, every newcomer carries an unspoken question. Are they here to trade or to take away part of my future? Suspicion is not a moral choice. It is the consequence of having something to protect. At the same time, power changed form. Before, power was situational and temporary. The one who knew the route was followed when movement was needed. The one with experience was heard in hard seasons. When the conditions changed, that power dissolved naturally. There was no fixed position to seize, no advantage stable enough to become privilege. With settlement, power began to cling to things that did not move: storehouses, land, water, and the ability to make long-term decisions. Whoever held the key to the granary did not only control today's food, they controlled tomorrow's survival. Whoever divided land did not only shape the present, they shaped the future of descendants. And when power is attached to fixed resources, it begins to protect itself. Those near the storehouse have reason to stay near the storehouse. Those who decide distribution have reason to preserve that decision-making authority. Gradually, power no longer needs emergency conditions in order to exist. It exists because it has become a condition for the system to function. This did not happen because humans suddenly became greedier than their ancestors. It happened because the new structure allowed power to remain long enough to accumulate. In migratory life, if someone tried to keep advantage too long, the community could leave. In settled life, leaving was no longer easy. Power was therefore challenged less, and it slowly became normal. With power, violence also changed role. Before, violence was personal and short-lived. Without machinery to sustain it, violence struggled to become structure. In settled life, when there was something to defend and power to hold, violence could be organized, maintained, and justified as part of order. The fence was first raised to keep out predators. Then it kept out other humans. And finally, it also held those inside through rules, obligations, and dependence on the system. Boundaries did not only divide space, they shaped behavior, belief, and the way people looked at one another. So, what humans traded was not only flexible power, but the ability for power to dissolve when circumstances changed. In the New World, power no longer depended entirely on immediate survival needs. It became part of a structure that had to be maintained. And when that structure endured long enough, it began to feel natural. Perhaps from this point, human history entered a different rhythm, one in which safety no longer came from knowing when to leave, but from holding tightly to what one has, one in which strangers were no longer bearers of news, but variables to be controlled, and one in which power no longer drifted with circumstances, but stayed, grew, and learned to defend itself. Family changed in the same direction. Before civilization, children belonged to the community. Care was distributed to reduce risk. When food and shelter became fixed, the family narrowed. Collective responsibility gradually yielded to private responsibility. Bonding remained but carried more pressure. A personal failure was no longer absorbed as easily by the whole group. Another change rarely named was the relationship to time. In migratory life, time was felt through light seasons and the rhythm of movement. There was no deadline, no debt of time. With settlement, time became calendar, became cycles that must be met. Sow at the wrong time, harvest in the wrong season, and the whole community pays. Time no longer flowed. It began to demand. Along with time, memory changed form. Before memory lived in people in story experience, the reminders spoken by the fire. As life grew more complex, memory was pushed outward. Symbols, records, marks, ledgers. This improved management, but it also separated memory from lived experience. People began to trust storage systems more than direct perception. Perhaps the deepest trade was the ability to live inside enough. Before civilization, life was not abundant, but its limits were clear. Enough to go on. Enough to raise children. Enough to pass the story forward. With settlement and accumulation, enough became blurry. There could always be more storage, more land, more protection. And when there is no natural stopping point, lack also loses its clear end. None of this means pre-civilized life was better, or that it should be reclaimed. It had its own harshness. Death was nearer. Illness was harder to escape. But those risks were often short and dispersed. They did not settle for generations inside the same structure. Civilization brought immense gains, larger populations, accumulated knowledge, art science, the ability to build far beyond individual life. But it also created a new fragility, the fragility of large systems. When a system fails, consequences no longer stop at a small group. They spread wider, deeper, and longer. Looking back, the question, what did we trade, is not meant to accuse the past. It helps us understand why many modern tensions do not come only from technology or speed, but from a deep misalignment between the human body, shaped by tens of thousands of years of movement, and the fixed structures we now live within. Perhaps the feeling of suffocation when we are forced to stay too long, or the strange relief we feel when we finally leave, is not personal failure. It is evolutionary memory. Some ancient part of us still remembers that there was once another way to live, where safety did not come from gripping tightly, but from knowing when to let go. We cannot return to that world, and perhaps we do not need to. But understanding what was traded allows us to ask more lucid questions about what we continue to trade today, and whether there are rhythms of release, spaces of flexibility, moments of letting go that can still be preserved even inside civilization, so that humans do not completely lose themselves within the structures they have built. As this story comes to rest, there is no final lesson waiting for you, no command to return to the past, no warning that civilization was a mistake, and no suggestion that life was somehow perfect before it began. The people we met tonight did not live better lives, and they did not live worse ones. They lived different lives. They traded comfort for closeness, certainty for flexibility, and permanence for belonging to a moving world. Civilization gave us shelter, memory, and scale. But it also gave us distance from the land, from one another, and sometimes from ourselves. The question is not whether we should go back. We cannot. The question is quieter than that. What parts of being human were never meant to be optimized? What rhythms were never meant to be rushed? And what did we leave behind, not because we were wrong, but because we chose a different path? If you're listening to this as you drift towards sleep, you don't need to answer those questions tonight. Just let them stay with you like embers after a fire has burned low. If this journey into our deep past resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you are right now? I read every comment, and in a way, that's how these stories continue to live. And if you'd like to keep exploring history, mythology, and the long memory of humanity together, you're always welcome to subscribe and join us again. For now, let the fire fade. Let the night settle back into place and rest, knowing that long before civilization, humans already knew how to do that. Good night.